Thank you all for joining me online for my presentation, Impact of Body Mass Index on Urinary Incontinence in Community Dwelling Australians aged 70 and above. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose and I work in Western Health, Melbourne, in Australia. Alongside my collaborators in Melbourne University and Monash University, I have the pleasure of presenting my research to you. So addressing issues with the BMI forms a pivotal role in the conservative management of urinary incontinence. And I believe it is a key area of opportunity that we may be overlooking in the older patients. Now, in women, the relationship between BMI and the various types of urinary incontinence is well established across different age groups. And lately, some studies has been emerging to suggest this association in older individuals as well. And in men, although the relationship between BMI and urinary incontinence is not yet conclusive, there's also emerging evidence. So should we actually just accept urinary incontinence as just part of aging, or look into factors that may help us address this further, especially within the conservative realm? As part of the ASPREE in reducing events in the elderly study, urinary incontinence data was collected. So the ASPREE study was a randomized double-blinded placebo-controlled trial which looked at the effect of aspirin longitudinally in participants aged over 70 in Australia and US. The bulk of participants were from Australia, and we had over 10,000 subjects who had urinary incontinence data captured within the sub-study termed ALSOP, which is the aspirin longitudinal study of older persons. And we now have baseline as well as 3-year follow-up data available, and I'm glad to be able to analyse and present the results to you today. So we had more than 16,000 participants in ASPREE, whereby we've got baseline urinary incontinence data available for both stress urinary incontinence as well as urge urinary incontinence, and that consisted of more than 14,000 patients. At 3 years follow-up, we only had stress urinary incontinence data available for analysis in a meaningful fashion, because unfortunately ASPREE was originally set out to look at the effect of aspirin and not specifically to look at urinary incontinence. The patients who were excluded included those who had stroke, dementia, those who were independent of institutionalized care, and those with life expectancy of less than 5 years. Overall, most of our participants were aged in their 7th decade with a mean age of 75.3, and they were towards the overweight end, whereby the mean BMI was 27.9. And we found that elevated BMI at baseline was correlated with both presence as well as severity of urinary incontinence in both men and women, which I'll cover in more detail later. And we found the overall odds ratio was found to be significant per unit increase in BMI at 1.05 for stress urinary incontinence and 1.04 for urge urinary incontinence. So before I present to you the more detailed data, I just want to clarify when we say frequent urge urinary incontinence, we're looking at those who reported being bothered by urge urinary incontinence at least once a week or more. And you can see from the table here that in women who are overweight and obese, as well as in men who are obese, there's a significant difference in relative risks. And also, those who reported no urge urinary incontinence had a BMI of 27.4 for women, and those reported urge urinary incontinence on most days was in fact 31.3. In men, the difference was a bit smaller, whereby those who reported no urinary incontinence had a mean BMI of 27.8, and those who reported urge urinary incontinence on most days was 28.4. In terms of the stress urinary incontinence domain, you can see that there is a difference as well in both women, overweight and obese, and men, those who are obese. And the mean BMI difference here was 27.4 in those reporting none in the women, and most days urinary incontinence, stress urinary incontinence, was 30.6. And in the men, the difference was 27.8 for those reporting none, and 28.4 for those reporting stress urinary incontinence on most days. When we looked at our 3 years follow-up data, the cumulative incidence for stress incontinence was just over 17%. And those who developed new stress urinary incontinence had a higher BMI of 27.9 versus those who remained continent with a BMI of 27.5. Those whose stress urinary incontinence resolved had a lower BMI of 27.8 compared to those whose stress urinary incontinence persisted with a BMI of 28.4. When we looked at our logistical regression adjusted for age, gender, smoking status, alcohol intake, and diabetes, we found the adjusted odds ratio for stress urinary incontinence, new stress urinary incontinence, was significant for those who had a BMI of 30 or above. So in conclusion, urinary incontinence has been found to be significantly associated with BMI in the community-dwelling men and women in our group, and that elevated BMI correlated with not only just the presence, but also the severity of both sides of urinary incontinence in both sexes. And it is associated with a higher incidence of stress urinary incontinence and is negatively associated with the resolution of stress urinary incontinence. So we believe we shouldn't just accept urinary incontinence as just part of aging, and there may be things that can be worked upon, and clinicians must pay specific attention to the effects of BMI on older patients when evaluating and treating them for any types of urinary incontinence. Thank you all very much for joining me.